The courtroom was packed so tightly you could feel the weight of every breath hanging in the air. The buzz of whispers cut off the second the judge entered, leaving only the creak of benches as the tension spread through the room like static. At the center of it all, across from me, the HOA president, our so-called queen of the neighborhood, stood red-faced, finger-jabbing the air as she shouted accusations that tumbled over each other. Her voice cracked on words like delinquent, violator, and disgrace. A police officer stood at her side, reading from documents with forced neutrality, though his jaw tightened each time her shrill tone cut too close. The audience craned forward, feasting on the spectacle. I didn't move. I didn't shout back. I simply held the folded paper in my hand, the $30,000 fine that began this entire storm. I held it lightly, almost casually, though I knew its weight. To me, it wasn't a penalty. It was evidence, proof of greed, arrogance, and the moment she overreached further than the law ever allowed. She wanted me to look rattled, to break under her volume, but instead I raised my eyes, steady and cold, and let silence speak louder than her tirade. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady as stone as he began to read the official charges: fraud, harassment, conspiracy, property law violations. Each word landed in the chamber like the toll of a heavy bell. A ripple of gasps moved through the audience. Even the police officer shifted, his brow furrowing at the sheer breadth of it. Her hand, still pointing at me, began to tremble. I leaned back slightly, never breaking eye contact, and let the line I'd been holding thunder in my mind. They thought 30,000 would shut me up, but it cost them everything. The gavel lifted, the judge's arm rising as silence collapsed into anticipation, and in that suspended heartbeat the entire room tilted forward, waiting for the strike that would change everything. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if you believe in giving bullies exactly what they deserve, hit subscribe now. You won't want to miss what happens next. Before the shouting matches, before the courtroom lights, it was just me, a patch of land, and a dream I refused to let anyone take from me. That cabin was more than 4 walls. Every inch of it carried the sweat from my hands and the lessons I'd learned about grit. I wasn't born into privilege. I clocked in every early shift, stayed late when others went home, and skipped more weekends out with friends than I can count, just so I could save enough to call a piece of earth my own. Lumber delivered on trucks, beams shouldered into place, nails driven one by one until the frame rose against the tree line. That's what my house was built on. Not money handed down, but work, stubbornness, and every sleepless night I told myself it would be worth it. And it was. Life out here wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Mornings started with steam from a chipped mug of coffee as I leaned against the porch railing I'd sanded myself. The forest hummed around me, birds stitching songs into the mist while the creek whispered over its stones behind the cabin. In the evenings I'd split logs for the fire, savoring the clean snap of wood and the warmth that followed in the stove. My dog settled at my boots, the silence broken only by the occasional bugle of a distant elk or the crackle of pine. No neighbors breathing down my neck, no rules beyond common sense, just me, the land, and the dignity of knowing peace had finally been earned. But peace doesn't sit well with everyone. The first time I noticed the shift, it was small. A notice taped to my mailbox about a new community assessment, even though my cabin wasn't part of their map. At first, I chuckled, shaking my head at the oversight. They couldn't mean me, I thought. My land sat beyond their reach, marked and deeded with boundaries older than their HOA bylaws. Still, I folded the paper, set it aside, and thought little of it. That was my mistake. Because people like her, the HOA president with her clipboard and her pearls polished with smugness, they feed on silence. They mistake courtesy for weakness, calm for surrender. And so, What started with one stray notice would soon barrel into a storm. My peaceful mornings, once filled with nothing but sunshine slicing through pines, would become littered with envelopes I never asked for, rules I never agreed to, and a woman convinced my independence was hers to break. I didn't know then what she was planning, but as I rocked gently on that porch chair, dogs at my feet and cabin warm behind me, I looked out across the tree line and thought I'd finally arrived at the life I was meant to live. I had no idea the intruder was already circling, searching for cracks to crawl through. Peace to her was just a target, and she was about to fire the first shot. It happened on a crisp morning, the kind where the forest smelled of pine and the air carried just enough chill to make the steam from my coffee comforting. I stood on my porch in flannel and boots, savoring the sunlight sliding through the trees, when the sound of heels on gravel cut across the quiet. She came marching up my driveway like she owned it, clipboard clutched tight, navy blazer buttoned, pearls gleaming, her chin lifted in a way that seemed to dare me to challenge her presence. Behind her, 2 board members trailed like shadows, pens poised as if witnessing the coronation of a queen. Without even a good morning, she launched into her performance. "You've been fined for multiple infractions," she declared, voice loud enough to echo across the trees. Her manicured finger jabbed toward my cabin, my yard, my truck in the drive. Unapproved exterior modifications, unauthorized use of land, excessive vehicles, and violation of HOA compliance standards. I took a slow sip from my coffee, staring at her over the rim of the mug. She didn't notice, or maybe she did, and hated it. She slapped a paper onto the porch table with the finality of a gavel. At the top, bold black letters, "Notice of lien, $30,000, total fine." My eyebrow arched. $30,000, written out like it was an everyday utility bill. She crossed her arms, waiting for me to sputter, to argue, to beg. Instead, I set down the mug and picked up the paper, folding it gently. 30 grand? For what exactly? I asked, my voice steady, calm. She recited more nonsense, throwing phrases like community standards and eligibility clauses around as if shouting them louder made them binding. Her board lackeys nodded dutifully at every word, like bobbleheads at a dashboard sermon. Here's the problem, though. My cabin wasn't even within their jurisdiction. My land deeds were clear, recorded with the county decades ago before her little board even existed. I knew it. Somewhere deep down, she knew it too. But arrogance is a dangerous fuel. She mistook silence as permission, calm as surrender. With one hand, she gestured dramatically to the woods behind me and said, "We're authorized to ensure compliance for all adjoining properties. You will need to pay this immediately or face foreclosure proceedings." Her words ripped through the quiet porch air like a chainsaw blade, but they didn't cut anything at all. I leaned back against the chair, smirking slightly, holding the coffee again in one hand and the ridiculous fine in the other. Neighbors had paused on the street now, curiosity tugging them closer. She glanced around, pleased at the small crowd she was performing for. But I never gave her the outburst she wanted. Instead, I let her voice bounce against the trees, let the anger in her cheeks flush brighter with every calm nod I offered. When she finally stalked away, her heels scuffing against the gravel, clipboard hugged like a shield, she assumed she'd landed her strike. She had no idea she'd just fired blanks. I watched her retreating figure with that $30,000 fine tucked under my arm, the corners of my mouth barely lifting. Who finds a cabin they don't even control? I murmured to myself. That question I knew was going to set the stage for everything that came next. The fine notice was only the spark. What followed was the smoke she tried to choke me with week after week. Envelopes started arriving with mechanical certainty, crisp white pages dressed in formal HOA letterhead, as if the logo itself gave them weight. Each one listed some new invented violation. According to her, my porch light disrupted community harmony after 9 p.m. My truck parked in my own driveway qualified as commercial equipment storage, and even the fresh coat of stain I had brushed onto the cabin's wood siding was labeled an unauthorized modification of exterior appearance. None of it matched the bylaws, none of it carried legal teeth. But she wasn't mailing them for the law, she was mailing them for the noise. In her world, intimidation was currency. Rumors traveled faster than paper, and soon enough I could feel it in the air. At the general store, voices dropped when I walked in. On the road into town, people glanced at my truck and then pretended not to. The script she was rehearsing at her board meetings was echoing across dinner tables now, that I was a problem resident, that I owed the community, that my refusal was an insult to everyone following the rules. Fear is contagious, and she knew how to seed it. A widow down the street stopped waving when I passed. A father kept his kids from chasing a ball into my yard. She wanted me isolated. She wanted me cornered. She wanted to draw a circle around me with nothing but suspicion and call it victory. But while she built her theater of gossip, I stayed steady. In the evenings, when the world quieted and the trees outside filled with crickets instead of whispers, I sat at my kitchen table with a binder open and a pen in hand. Every single notice, every fabricated letter, every bogus regulation, I logged it. Dates carefully written, attachments scanned, screenshots backed up on a drive she couldn't touch. When signs accusing me of failure to comply appeared tacked to the community bulletin board, I photographed them before they were torn down. When packages began being delayed or rerouted with HOA hold requests, I saved the slips. She thought repetition made her stronger. She never stopped to consider that for me, repetition only meant the evidence grew thicker. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. While she ranted in high pitches to neighbors, digging her heels deeper with every invented accusation, I built my case one quiet piece at a time. On my side of the fence there was calm, order, proof arranged in neat plastic sleeves. On hers, there was noise, bluster, and the desperation of someone mistaking volume for power. At block gatherings, our roles played out again and again. She raised her voice until the veins in her neck stood out. I nodded politely, said little, and watched her exhaust herself. The neighbors thought my silence was compliance. It wasn't. It was patience. By the third month, my binder had swollen thick enough to bow under its own weight. I flipped through it one night, the scent of smoke still went from the wood stove, each page a reminder of how far she had already gone. The lies weren't slowing, they were escalating. Every fabricated violation was another stitch in the net around her. She thought she'd built a wall high enough to contain me, but she hadn't noticed that bricks crack from the bottom long before they topple from the top. As I slid the latest letter into its sleeve, she was planning her next move, rehearsing her next performance in front of the neighbors, convinced she had won. She didn't realize she'd already given me every proof I needed to strip her title from her hands. And as I closed the binder that night with a quiet snap, one question kept echoing in my head. How much louder would she get when she realized no one was listening anymore? If the early phase of her campaign had relied on official-looking envelopes, the next wave turned into something uglier, something meant to stain my name in the eyes of anyone who glanced my way. Flyers showed up on the bulletin boards near the post office and taped to lamp poles at the edge of the community. Cheap paper printed with bold red headlines warning about unpaid debts and non-compliant residents endangering neighborhood values. There was no signature, of course, but every detail pointed its finger at me. A cabin near the creek. Red shutters painted without permission. A resident refusing to comply with over $30,000 in fines. To a stranger, it might have looked like community vigilance. To those who knew me, it was simply another round of slander. Residents stopped pretending they didn't know who the flyers meant. Eyes followed me at the hardware store. Conversations slowed to silence when I walked past in the diner. She wanted me marked, and for a while, it was working. Packages I'd been expecting for weeks started arriving in tatters, soggy from rain or ripped open and clumsily resealed. A box of tools came back stamped, recipient moved, address invalid, even though my address hadn't changed in years. Some days my mail was missing entirely. When I confronted the clerk, he shuffled behind the counter, avoiding my eyes as he admitted there had been special holds requested by the HOA for compliance checks. Compliance checks. They'd reached into systems that were never theirs to touch. It was petty sabotage, but it was constant, a steady drip meant to wear me down. The smear didn't stay confined to paper and mail either. At a town meeting, she raised her voice for everyone to hear, declaring that certain residents were compromising the financial health of the community with their selfish refusal to pay dues. Heads nodded because most people didn't know better, because repetition makes lies sound like truth if you're not paying close attention. Every baseless claim tightened her circle of loyalists and deepened the cracks between me and anyone too afraid to speak against her. The performance was effective, at least on the surface. But while she spun her theater, I stood steady. Every flyer I tore down was photographed first. Every ripped package slip went into the sleeve of my binder. Every tampered envelope I received became a time-stamped brick in a wall of proof. I didn't rise to her bait, didn't shout in the meetings, didn't trade her volume for more noise. I smiled, I nodded, I quietly built a record. To her, silence confirmed victory. To me, silence was patience. The only kind of rope you need when someone insists on tying it for themselves. Still, there were nights the weight of her lies pressed heavy. Standing at my cabin window, light flooding the desk where pages of evidence sprawled, I wondered if neighbors I'd once shared beers with across campfires now muttered my name like a cautionary tale. That was the cost of her poison, not just fines and flyers, but the erosion of trust. Yet I reminded myself again and again, the truth, when revealed, has a gravity far stronger than gossip. And when the tide turned, those same neighbors would see your theater for what it was. By the end of that month, the binder bulged with her arrogance. Flyers, notices, tampered mail labels, it all sat cataloged in plastic. I stood over it one evening, flipping each page, the faint snap of plastic loud in the quiet cabin, and thought about how high her voice had climbed lately, shrilling as her confidence began to fray at the edges. Anger made her sloppy. Anger made her bold. But anger wasn't her sharpest move. Desperation was. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of this content designed especially and exclusively for men like you. Men who seek to live with more energy, more presence, and more purpose. The breakthrough didn't come with a loud confrontation, but in the quiet hum of my cabin one late night, when papers were spread across the table and a single desk lamp cast its gold circle of light. I had finally pulled the county plat maps I'd requested weeks ago, a stack of official records and deeds, dry on the surface but humming with the authority of ink and signatures. I set them side by side with the HOA bylaws, flipping between them, tracing the lines, and highlighting the property boundaries. My cabin sat neatly, squarely, undeniably outside their reach. Not on a border, not straddling some technicality. Entirely separate. No clause in those bylaws touched the dirt under my boots or the shingles above my head. Every letter, every $30,000 threat, every claim of jurisdiction had been built on nothing but arrogance and hope that I wouldn't check. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stark map lines, feeling something cold and sharp settle into my chest. These people weren't simply overzealous. They were frauds. They had fabricated authority, crafted official-looking papers, and wielded them like clubs with no legal backbone. Suddenly, the stack of envelopes I had carefully hole-punched into my binder changed shape in my mind. Not a nuisance, not intimidation, but evidence. I pulled the binder closer and began sliding the freshly printed plat maps in to their sleeves, side by side with the notices that claimed they held sway. The contradiction was perfect and undeniable. The lines that showed they had no control. The letters that screamed they did. That was the proof. It would have been easy to stop there, easy to shrug and call it my personal victory. Proof that if I stood up long enough, they could never touch me. But as the nights ticked into early mornings, as I went back through old community records, something larger started to take shape. Buried in the bylaws, meeting notes, and casual reports, I found names, families, widows, veterans, people who had been fined under suspiciously similar violations. One older couple had quietly paid thousands for landscaping deficiencies. A newcomer had been told his roof shingles weren't approved material, even though the rules never specified one. They had folded rather than fight, writing checks to preserve peace. And just like that, it hit me. This wasn't about me at all. I wasn't their first victim. I was just the one who refused to sign the check. That realization landed harder than the $30,000 demand ever had. Because if they'd tried it with me, they tried it with others. And if those others had paid, then this wasn't harassment anymore. It was systematic fraud. It was extortion disguised as neighborly order. And the fraud didn't just ripple across one boundary. It poisoned the very trust a community is supposed to run on. I started reaching out quietly. Phone calls made in the early evening, emails worded with careful vagueness at first. To my surprise, doors opened much faster than I expected. A retired teacher admitted she'd received fines for yard violations the year she helped care for her sick husband. She had paid several thousand just to stop the board's threats. Another man, who had long since moved out, said he'd handed over nearly $15,000 after being told his cabin extension lacked design approval. He showed me his original permit, authorized by the county, never under HOA review. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate shakedowns dressed up in letterhead. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could hardly sit still. What started as my fight had twisted into something bigger, something darker. This wasn't just an HOA obsessed with control. This was an HOA forging authority it didn't have, threatening foreclosure it couldn't enact, and siphoning money into accounts no one outside their ring ever questioned. My binder was no longer my defense. It was becoming a weapon. I closed it with deliberate force, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin like an oath whispered into the night. My peace had been shattered months ago. The board had seen to. But now I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing for every neighbor too frightened or too weary to fight, every family that had been bullied into paying silence money. And if her arrogance had lit this fire, I'd make sure every single forged dollar she'd collected burned with it when the truth finally came to light. The thought struck me then, as sharp as the night air creeping in through the open porch window, and I wasn't their only victim. Realizing I wasn't their only victim shifted everything. Suddenly my binder of notices wasn't just a shield. It was the cornerstone of a much bigger case. But no battle this crooked could be fought alone. So I started quietly linking threads, reaching out to people who had once merely nodded politely at me in town, people I suspected had either been burned or bullied into silence. It began with the widow down the road, her voice shaking as she poured coffee for us at her kitchen table. She admitted she had paid nearly $6,000 in maintenance assessments for a community pool that never existed. Her hands trembled as she slid the old letters toward me, and I gently tucked them into a folder, promising she hadn't suffered for nothing. Next came the ex-board treasurer, a man who had resigned without explanation a year earlier. We met at a diner off the highway, his eyes darting toward the door every time it opened. Over pie and weak coffee, he admitted he'd seen funds redirected to consultants that didn't exist, invoices rubber-stamped for lawn care jobs that were never done, and worst of all, shell companies tied directly to the HOA president's husband. He leaned across the booth and, with a heaviness in his voice, pulled a small thumb drive from his pocket. "I should have spoken up sooner," he murmured, sliding it into my hand. I didn't let my smile show, but the weight of it felt heavier than the pie plate it rested on. That drive was either dynamite or salvation, maybe both. Firefighters came next. One, still in uniform, approached me after a community safety talk, his jaw tight with anger as he whispered that he had been called to inspect properties tagged with fake safety notices from the HOA. They weren't county-issued, he confirmed. They were counterfeits. We had to file them in a drawer instead of a system. His testimony, even off the record, bolstered what I already suspected. They hadn't just fabricated fines. They had forged authority documents intended to scare people into obedience. The building inspector's story was even darker. Over the phone, his voice came clipped, businesslike, but his words were sharp daggers. He explained she had offered him cash, bribery in plain daylight, if he'd label a residence shed unsafe, forcing compliance costs that never should have existed. He had refused, but the attempt itself was incriminating enough to widen my case file tenfold. Each day added new voices to the chorus. Neighbors showed up with notices, some crumpled from years of storage, some pristine and untouched. One man carried a small black notebook filled with dates of fines he'd paid in cash, payments with no receipts ever returned. Another, a woman who'd moved her family out after years of harassment, cried as she recounted 28 separate violations fabricated against her for keeping a swing set in her yard. I documented it all. My nights turned into a rhythm of scanning, labeling, and filing. By now my binder had evolved into a wall of evidence, with color-coded tabs and subfolders flagged red for fraud, blue for fabricated jurisdiction, green for financial schemes. The thumb drive from the treasurer revealed exactly what he'd promised. Bank transfers, receipts, emails directing funds into accounts tied to dummy businesses. I didn't need law enforcement to tell me what I was seeing screamed embezzlement. The beauty was in the simplicity. While she screamed louder, everything she touched kept creating more proof against her. By the time the second month ended, my cabin looked less like a retreat and more like a command center. Boxes stacked with affidavits leaned against the wall. Flash drives were safely backed up in 2 places. Witness lists were drafted, printed, tucked into a locked metal safe. She thought her reputation as queen of the HOA made her untouchable. What she didn't realize was that every whispered conversation, every thumb drive slid across a diner booth, every folded flyer tucked into my hand was tightening the net. Calmly, deliberately, I was building something she couldn't shout her way out of, and when the day came to take this to court, her arrogance wouldn't stand a chance against the truth I'd been quietly compiling piece by piece. The trap was finished now. It was only a matter of setting it. The morning I filed the lawsuit, the cold steel of the courthouse door felt like crossing into enemy territory, except this time I wasn't the one on defense. I was carrying the first offensive strike. My attorney slid the thick folder across the clerk's counter with the poise of someone who knew exactly what she was unleashing. The lawsuit spelled out fraud, harassment, intimidation, and misuse of funds with receipts, sworn affidavits, and the map that proved my cabin lay entirely outside their reach, alongside it followed finely tuned subpoenas. Every bank statement, every contractor invoice, every line item they had buried for years would now be demanded in black and white. While she had banked on rumors, I was now armed with facts. Numbers don't lie, but she would. When word reached her, she did exactly what I knew she'd do. She screamed. Flyers cropped up on every bulletin board and mailbox, blurry photos of me taped under headlines like "Unstable Resident Suing the Community" and "Dangerous Troublemaker." At the next meeting, she pounded her fist on the table, lips curling around accusations that I was fabricating evidence and attacking family values. Her voice clawed at the ceiling, desperate for authority. But the harder she tried, the less convincing she seemed. If his claims were real, one man muttered under his breath, why fight so hard to discredit him? That whisper carried. Neighbors who once nodded silently began shifting in their seats. A mother crossed her arms instead of clapping. The retired teacher who had been harassed herself locked eyes with me and gave the faintest nod. Doubt had slipped in, clinging to her words like a shadow she couldn't shake. And once doubt enters a crowd, it spreads faster than fear. Back home, I flipped through the stack of new flyers she'd littered the streets with, slid them into plastic sleeves, and thought about how blind she was to the irony. Every desperate accusation she printed, every word she spat in panic, all of it became new evidence, not of my instability, but of hers. She had lived on power built out of paper and noise. Now the paper was mine, and soon the numbers would be too, pulled from the banks where she had hidden them, ledgers she thought no one would ever see. I knew she would keep shouting, keep panicking, keep stringing her loyalists across the stage of her little empire. But looking at the evidence, massed in neat rows, I realized she was no longer the hunter. She was the quarry. The counterattack wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, the silence of proof was deafening enough. The day of the trial dawned gray, the kind of morning that made every breath feel heavier than it should, as though the clouds themselves knew a reckoning was near. By the time I stepped into the courthouse, the gallery was already filling with neighbors, reporters, and even curious onlookers who had come just to witness the unraveling of a woman everyone thought untouchable. The oak-paneled walls hummed with subdued chatter, benches creaked as residents leaned closer to one another, and all of it quieted instantly when the bailiff announced the judge's entrance. I sat at the plaintiff's table, binder stacked neatly in front of me like a fortress of truth. Across the aisle, she sat in her trademark lilac blazer, pearls gleaming defiantly against her neck, chin raised high as if that pose alone still carried power. But the faint twitch in her jaw, the tight grip of her hands on the table, they betrayed her. My attorney stood first, shoulders squared, voice calm but precise. "Your Honor," she began, "today we will show not one mistake, not one misunderstanding, but a systematic pattern of fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority by the HOA president and her board." She clicked the small remote, and the first exhibit filled the screen behind her. Exhibit A, the infamous $30,000 fine notice projected side by side with the county plat map I had dug out months before. Clean black boundary lines revealed what every resident could now see clearly. My cabin and the land it stood on were completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The audience shifted, whispers snaking through the benches. The judge leaned in slightly, the furrow in his brow deepening. My attorney let the silence stretch before speaking again. "This is not a matter of interpretation. This is a matter of geography and law. Any fine levied here had no legal basis whatsoever." She shifted to Exhibit B, a series of EMI, ELAs and bank records uncovered from the treasurer's thumb drive. Projected in big bold text for the whole room to read, the words painted a damning portrait. Funds labeled as consulting expenses were funneled to companies that, when checked, didn't exist. Invoices for lawn care services, tens of thousands of dollars worth, flagged to accounts tied directly to the president's husband. My attorney flipped through the pages like a school teacher reciting lessons, her voice measured, drawing the room into the rhythm. Gasps erupted when one email appeared on screen. "Ensure all board signatures are returned before releasing transfer. Keep this between us." The handwriting at the bottom? Hers. Next came the witnesses. The firefighter entered in uniform, helmet under his arm, and described arriving at properties to find counterfeit hazard inspection notices taped to doors. "They weren't ours," he testified firmly. "They weren't county-issued. They were counterfeits used to scare people." The inspector followed, voice flat but sharp, recounting the day she tried to bribe him to declare a shed unsafe so the family inside could be fined into compliance. "She offered me cash in an envelope," he told the court. The words landed heavy, undeniable. Then the ex-treasurer took the stand. He looked exhausted, like a man finally laying down a burden. His testimony was careful but relentless, every line threading back to her. We began transferring funds that had no legitimate purpose, he admitted. When I questioned it, I was silenced. So I left. My attorney showed the thumb drive, labeled archives, scrolling behind him. Did you provide these records because you knew they were fraudulent? Yes. The gallery exhaled in a wave of murmurs, the rustle of clothes and shifting feet swelling until the bailiff barked for order. And then came the final nail, the recording. The screen went dark, but the speakers crackled alive with tinny audio, muffled voices of a board meeting. For 30 seconds there was chatter, then her voice cut sharp and unmistakable. That house is coming down, one way or another. My house, my land, my life. The words hung in the courtroom like a noose. Residents gasped. One woman in the back actually clapped a hand over her mouth, the sound involuntary. In that instant, all her years of shrill authority evaporated. For the first time, she looked small, stripped, powerless. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just sat there steady, because I knew this was never about noise. It had always been about patience. She thrived when people flinched, when they bowed under the weight of false authority. But today authority was on my side. Truth was louder than her voice. My attorney gathered the exhibits into one final stack, closing her statement with words that lingered like steel. Your Honor, numbers don't lie. Records don't lie. Witnesses don't lie. Only she did, and her lies nearly destroyed this community. The judge didn't move at first. He read through the final summary sheets, lips pressed in a firm line, his expression one of a man who has heard far too much to dismiss it as chance. Then, slowly, he reached for the gavel resting on the desk before him. The polished wood caught the overhead light as he lifted it into the air. The gallery leaned forward, not even breathing now. The sound hadn't come yet, but everyone felt it racing toward them like lightning before the thunder. All the threads, the fines, the harassment, the fraud, even the arson that shadowed it, pulled together into this singular moment. The entire room balanced on the edge of that raised gavel, waiting for the sound that would collapse her empire in a single strike. And in that instant, just before it fell, the world went utterly still. When the gavel finally came down, the sound was like a crack of thunder rolling through the rafters, and its echo followed me far beyond the courtroom walls. Within days, the story spread across the valley, filling headlines and mourning. Conversations. HOA president found guilty of fraud and extortion. Her name was plastered beside words she could never smooth over with another speech or flyer. The hammer had fallen, and with it, the empire she thought untouchable crumbled. The board fractured almost immediately. Board members who had nodded faithfully behind her for years quietly submitted their resignations. Some vanished from public eye, others simply ducked their heads in shame. But by the end of the week, the HOA was dissolved, stripped of its authority and exposed as the hollow shell it had become. The restitution order sounded almost unreal when the judge read it out. Every fraudulent fine, every ill-gotten dollar had to be returned. She was ordered to repay me for damages, cover my legal costs, and provide restitution to others the board had extorted over the years. For some of those neighbors, it meant thousands back in their pockets. For me, it meant vindication. The $30,000 notice that had started this nightmare was nullified. Its shadow lifted, and in its place stood an affirmation that what had been stolen would be rebuilt tenfold. Around town, the ice between me and my neighbors began to thaw. People who had once looked away when whispers stained my name now stopped to shake my hand. A few came to my porch, voices low, apology in their eyes. We believed her lies, one neighbor admitted, guilt stretching his words thin. It was easier than standing up. I didn't meet those confessions with anger. I recognized the fear they lived under. It was the same fear she relied on for power. Fear had silenced them, but the verdict freed them. It wasn't long before a community election was held. For the first time, the candidates weren't polished pretenders or loudmouth tyrants. They were people who genuinely wanted their neighborhood back. A teacher who wanted fairness. A young father who wanted safe tie for his children. Older couples who longed for peace after years of petty battles. The vote was decisive, done in open daylight with hands raised and voices steady. The faces who replaced her weren't motivated by control but by service. As for me, my work shifted from paperwork to lumber. My old cabin, blackened and scarred, was finally cleared away, and in its place a new foundation was poured. I stood with the builders, watching beams rise again, but this time I let myself expand the vision. I added a wider porch, big enough for family gatherings and the occasional visit from the very neighbors who once avoided me. I planted a full bed of sunflowers along the fence line, the same flowers she had once mocked as unapproved flora. Their golden faces turned toward the morning sun, defiant proof that her words no longer mattered. When the final nail was driven and the walls stood clean and proud, I leaned against the railing with my dog pressed at my side, the sound of the creek carrying through the quiet. The cabin wasn't just wood and shingles anymore. It was a monument, a living reminder that patience and truth had outlasted arrogance and fraud. My peace had been stolen once, but I'd claimed it back, bigger than before. And as I looked out across the land, I knew that no clipboard, no smug smile, and no counterfeit power could ever take it from me again. When I look back now, the funniest part is how simple it all really was. She built her entire reign on noise, on people afraid to question, on residents who assumed her word carried the weight of law. But bullies only thrive until someone knows the rules better than they do. That was her fatal mistake. She assumed I wouldn't check the county plat maps. She assumed I'd toss my head down and pay the fines just to get her off my back. She assumed my silence meant surrender. What she never realized was that patience isn't weakness. It's a trap. Here's a fact a lot of homeowners don't realize. In most states, an HOA has no power beyond its governing documents. Its jurisdiction extends only to the properties explicitly included in its recorded bylaws filed with the county. If your land isn't listed, they can write all the notices they want. But those papers are legally worthless. They cannot fine you. They cannot foreclose, and they cannot fabricate covenants that were never voted on and recorded. The moment they try, it stops being enforcement and becomes fraud. And fraud carries penalties far sharper than any petty violation ever could. That knowledge was what tipped the board's intimidation into their undoing. Because numbers don't lie on bank statements. County maps don't bend to intimidation. And when you pile testimony atop testimony, when you layer paper over paper until the weight is too much to deny, even the loudest Karen's voice finally cracks. She thought the system protected her crown, but all the system needed was someone stubborn enough to use it correctly. So if you're listening now, standing where I once stood with envelopes piling in your mailbox and whispers circling your name, I'll tell you this: don't fold. File, document, learn the bylaws better than they do, and let their arrogance supply you with ropes they'll never untangle. They may laugh louder at first, but no one laughs when the gavel drops. And now, I'll turn it to you. Have you faced your own HOA tyrant? Someone who fined you without cause, threatened you with rules that didn't exist, or tried to bully you into silence? Share your story below. They might be next. Because every time we talk, their power shrinks, and every lie becomes easier to expose. If you believe bullies deserve exactly the kind of downfall she met, like this video, share it with someone still fighting their own battle, And subscribe for more HOA revenge stories and Karen justice tales. At AJ Stories, we'll keep telling them until every fake crown gets knocked off.